Hello, I'm Gary Millett, and this is BMT-230 Biomedical Wireless Networks, spring of 2023. This is topic 1A. It's called Wireless System Standards and Standards Organizations. Now, I'm going to start a little bit differently here. I'm not really going to talk about biomedical wireless networks to start. You'll see where I'm going, I hope, in a few minutes, so let's get going. Since it's predicted that most future IoT applications will be implemented through the use of wireless technologies, and that would include biomedical applications, it would be instructive to look at the various industry, government, and standards organizations that are involved in the decision-making process concerning this dynamic technology field. Wireless is very much like networking. Turns out there are worldwide standards. Then our emphasis will turn to the organizations involved with decision making for the various different industries that are involved with the use of IoT technology, highlighting medical device industry and automotive industry uses of wireless data transmission. So this slide shows how will IoT devices be connected. And again, IoT devices are the ones that are used to implement various applications that will be biomedical applications. So if you take a look at this slide, it starts in 2015, and the A next to it means actual, so the actual numbers go up to 2019, and then 2020 to 2025 are predicted values. Matter of fact, this slide was updated. It says actuals until the second quarter of 2020, and you notice that there's a 29% growth from 2015 to about 2019, and of course in 2020 we had the start of the pandemic. Things have slowed down a little bit, and there's been predicted 21% growth from 2019 to 2025. And if you take a look at the numbers, you might notice here we're talking 30.9 billion devices connected to the internet. These are connected, again, IoT devices. Now, the color coding shows the bright red is wireless personal area networks, or wireless PANs. The not so bright red, the next one up, is wireless local area networks, or Wi-Fi. The kind of pinkish is cellular, 2G, 3G, and 4G. The very light pinkish is low-powered wide area networks and things like LoRa. The darkest blue is wired, which is a very thin line, as you notice. Other is, again, a very thin line. 5G is thinner still, and that doesn't come into play until 2023, it shows basically on this graph. And then there's wireless metropolitan area networks, which is kind of a low number. So again, this fairly recent graphic indicates predictions of how future IoT devices will be connected to the internet, which impacts greatly biomedical wireless networks. And again, notice the relatively low number of IoT devices predicted to be connected to the internet via hardwired connections, like a LAN connections. Now I've taken and blown this diagram up a little bit so you can see a little bit better, and again, now you might be able to see those very thin lines up towards the top of 2024, 2025, the wireless metropolitan area networks, the wireless MANs, 5G, other, and so forth. And again, very minor and small percentage of the connections. So what are spectrum policy and regulatory issues that we observe? As wireless technology has matured, there's been a growing need for entities that deal with issues related to spectrum policy and regulation of the radio spectrum. So in the United States, the early radio broadcasting era was somewhat like the Wild West. There was a Radio Act of 1912 that stated that every radio station needed to be licensed and operate on a frequency between a certain wavelength range. Otherwise, there were very few other restrictions. Now, early U.S. regulation occurred later on in 1927. We have the Radio Act of 1927 was passed in an attempt to bring order to what had been the chaotic development of radio broadcasting during its early years. That's 15 years later than what we just talked about in 1912. Now, station licenses would specify the power level and frequency in an attempt to bring some order to the rapid development of the industry. The Federal Radio Commission, FRC, came into being. Later on, 7 years to be exact, the Federal Communications Commission would replace this organization in 1934. So the FCC we should take a closer look at. Ever since its inception in 1934, the FCC has served as a regulatory arm of the government, dealing with and regulating new wireless technologies as the field has evolved and matured. Certainly, in the U.S., this has included the assignment of various frequency bands to different services. This has been an ongoing process as new wireless services have been introduced. For example, television, we started with VHF, then we introduced UHF later on. Matter of fact, the first UHF station was WWLP, channel 22, here in the Springfield area. Then FM radio. FM radio was before television, but nevertheless, FM radio, cellular, IEEE, wireless technologies, and so forth, all been regulated by the FCC. There's something known as the UNII bands. They're originally known as the Instrumentation, Scientific, and Medical, or ISM bands. Internationally defined by the ITU, these bands were reserved for it says non-telecommunications uses. It did not require licensing. So let me just think about that for a second. It turns out that basically these were unlicensed frequencies. So instrumentation, scientific, and medical uses could use these. I'm going to have to go and change that slide. More commonly known now as UNII, or Unlicensed National Information Infrastructure bands, these bands have been used for low-power data transmission systems like IEEE 802.11, or again, Wi-Fi. Today there are many UNII bands in use around the world for different types of wireless applications. Oh, and this slide did not come out. Interesting enough, hopefully in my unnarrated slide you'll see this chart shows all the UNII bands. How about regulation around the world? Ever since the advent of radio broadcasting, different countries around the world have taken different steps to regulate its use. However, radio waves do not recognize boundaries. Hence, international or regional organizations have been more involved in spectrum policy and regulation. We have the European Union, and it has recently formed the Radio Spectrum Policy Program, or RSPP, and Pacific Rim countries have their regional organization called the Asia Pacific Telecommunity. There's something called the ITU. The ITU is the International Telecommunications Union. It is an agency authorized by the United Nations to deal with the regulatory issues on a global basis, an international treaty developed to deal with radio. So the ITU has three subdivisions that deal with radio communications, standardization, and development. The radio communications section deals with the spectrum needs of new and emerging wireless applications, and there's the link to that shown on this slide. What about the WRC? Well, again, one of the ITU's most important activities is spectrum policy, and as such it sets the agenda for the International World Radio Communications Conference, or WRC. This conference meets every 3 to 4 years or more often if needed. Prior to modern times, it used to meet less frequently when it was the WARC. I think it used to meet every 6 years. But technology has sped things up. At the WRC conference, each member has a single vote or equal say in what happens. Since many nations are not involved in the wireless industry, they tend to vote for what the ITU proposes, and that's determined beforehand. So at WRC 19, some of the topics of interest that were discussed at this conference were possible new 5G cellular frequency bands in the millimeter wave region, and another topic of interest is the radio bands between 5150 megahertz and 5925 megahertz. Some of these 5 gigahertz frequency bands are already used for unlicensed Wi-Fi services, but there's a worldwide desire to increase the spectrum in this range for higher bandwidth, greater data throughput Wi-Fi systems. So some of the results from WRC 19, which was held, looks like October 28th, 2019 to November 22nd of 2019. Some of the results were the addition of new bands for 5G, which is known as BMT-230. That came up from the ITU. 24.25 to 27.5 gigahertz, 37 to 43.5 gigahertz, 45.5 to 47 gigahertz, 47.2 to 48.2, and 66 to 71 gigahertz were identified as new bands. The frequencies in the 40 to 50 gigahertz range are not worldwide. Use of 4.8 to 4.99 gigahertz is okay in 40 countries. And the 20 to 30 gigahertz range has controversy due to weather satellites at 23.6 to 24 gigahertz. What about WRC 23? Well, we'll get that in a second. More frequencies for Wi-Fi in the 5 to 6 gigahertz range. Today we have new tri-band Wi-Fi access points. They've hit the market here in the United States. And WRC 23 is supposed to meet this coming November 20th to, I think, December 15th, it looks like, in Dubai. WRC 23 will deal with frequencies above 71 gigahertz. What about the implementation of WRC or on ITU radio regulations? Well, in theory, decisions made at the WRC are binding on all nations, but quite often some of the participating nations are exempted from these new regulations by the grandfathering of already existing radio services. An example of this: in the rest of the world, the 3.5 gigahertz frequency band may be used for unlicensed Wi-Fi. However, in the U.S., this band is reserved for military use. We have the early warning missile system defense systems on the east and west coast. So it turns out it's a little bit of a problem here in the United States. 3 years ago, on January 27, 2020, the FCC authorized full commercial deployment in the 3.5 gigahertz band. This is still a work in progress, and I have a link to that decision. So let's take a look at wireless system standards at this point. Next, we consider the standards that govern the wireless equipment used by the various wireless services. For decades now, in order to allow for interoperability between equipment from different manufacturers built for the same purpose, standards have been put in place that guarantee that this will be so. In a global economy, this is the only way that the guarantee of interoperability may be kept. What about non-data networking? Well, first let's consider the non-data networking wireless technology systems used by automobiles as sensors for advanced driver assistance systems, or ADAS systems. Radar technology is considered to be a key technology for implementing automotive ADAS systems like collision avoidance. Although these automotive radar systems are low power, it is typical to have a government agency that regulates the transmission of RF radiation within a country. In the U.S., this entity is the FCC. In the U.S., the only regulation of the low-power radar system used with automotive ADAS systems is done by the FCC. These regulations are only related to the frequency of operation and other technical characteristics of the RF signal emission. In February of 2015, the FCC issued a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPR, that modifies various previous rules to allow for the operation of vehicle radars in the 76 to 81 gigahertz band, and this operation would be unlicensed. Prior to this, there were other vehicle radar systems that worked in different frequency bands, notably between 22 and 29 gigahertz. But it now appears that the manufacturers of these devices have settled on this higher millimeter wave band as a default standard due to improved operating characteristics. Notice that there are no present standards related to the vehicle radars themselves. Manufacturers are free to design and implement whatever systems that they believe will do the job. How about LiDAR? LiDAR is considered a wireless system even though it uses light frequencies or wavelengths in its operation. Actually, infrared wavelengths so as to be safe for human eyesight. So LiDAR is we send out a laser signal and we scan that signal and we look at the reflections for everything in the scanning area, and we actually come up with a dot matrix kind of 3D image of what's out there. A point cloud, it's sometimes called. There are no FCC regulations for these types of systems. The only restriction involves output power levels and eye safety. See the ANSI standards for visible light. Typically the human eye, it's unknown for other animals, we don't know, does not focus wavelengths other than visible light. However, very high powers can cause burns. Remember, they were infrared. Early on in the evolution of wireless data networks, there were proposed European standards. ETSI is the European Standards Organization, for a type of wireless data networking system called HyperLAN, and also some competing Japanese standards. As has happened many times before, the marketplace tends to decide on what becomes known as a default standard. In this case, the standards proposed by the IEEE won out. The first Wi-Fi standard was known as IEEE 802.11, and since then the IEEE has been in charge of maintaining the 802.11 standard. Today there is a suite of IEEE wireless technology standards for data transmission. The most well-known IEEE standards are IEEE 802.11 or Wi-Fi, IEEE 802.15 or Bluetooth, and IEEE 802.16 WiMAX. Now recently the Bluetooth Special Interest Group, or SIG it's known, has taken over maintenance of the 802.15 standard. And I show the web link to the Bluetooth website. These standards represent different wireless data services, and they're constantly changing amendments to the original standards. One may find these standards at www.ieee.org. Quite separately, the wireless cellular industry has had their own organizations to promote and standardize their systems. Early on, there were several cellular organizations that were aligned with the type of radio technology that was being used by different segments of the industry. As the technology matured and the industry was driven by the desire for wireless data over the cellular system, a more global approach to cellular evolved. The ITU oversaw the BMT-230 initiative. That was a proposal to create the third generation, or 3G, of cell phone technology to provide high-speed, at the time it was high-speed, wireless data over cell phones at the start of the new century. Since that time, the cellular industry has now gone through two evolutions. First 4G and now 5G, basically 10 years for each generation. During that time, various radio transmission technologies, or RTTs, have fallen out of favor and others have gained favor over the transmission of high-speed wireless data. The ITU is now overseeing the BMT 2020 initiative, which is 5G and its various updates. Presently, the organization charged with overseeing the technical aspects of the cellular industry is known as the 3GPP, or Third Generation Partnership Project. This is a collaboration of the 7 major worldwide cellular wireless telecommunications standards organizations. They have written the system standards that will comply with the previously mentioned ITU's BMT 2020 requirements, which are again also known as 5G, a standard driven by applications of the Internet of Things, which includes ADAS and autonomous cars, and they will continue to write a new standard that will extend and update this service. Now, changing gears a little bit here, looking at other government organizations of wireless. Two of the most important government organizations in the United States involved with the research, standardization, or standardizing and regulation of emerging automotive safety technologies that involve wireless technology are the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, a lot of times called NHTSA, and the United States Department of Transportation, USDOT, which was involved with the Intelligent Transportation Systems. Their websites are noted here. The USDOT opened in 1967 and has a history of being involved with the improvement of all aspects of the U.S. transportation systems. Actually, the term Intelligent Transportation System, or ITS, was adopted way back in 1994, coming up 30 years ago. In 1997, ITS America petitioned the FCC to allocate 75 megahertz of spectrum and then a 5.9 gigahertz band for what was called DSRC, or Dedicated Short-Range Communications, that could be used for high-speed data transmission for communications-based active safety applications. And as a matter of fact, if I think about what I've read recently, it turns out the weather across the country is typical winter with snowstorms and so forth, and it seems to me this past week, and here it is, actually today is January 31st of 2023, there have been numerous extreme pileups of 50 vehicles on highways because of ice and snow and so forth. Those would be the type of safety applications we're talking about using wireless, where we could talk, send messages to cars about, slowdowns ahead and, try to avoid these massive pileups. So let's change gears a little bit, talk about the FDA and the medical devices industry. The medical industry in America is under the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. The FDA regulates the sale of medical device products, including diagnostic tests, in the U.S. and monitors the safety of all regulated medical products. In the U.S., FDA regulates the sale of medical device products. Before a medical device can be legally sold in the U.S., the person or company that wants to sell a device must seek approval from the FDA. To gain approval, they must present evidence that the device is reasonably safe and effective for a particular use. The FCC and the FDA have been working together in this area for some time, and there's a link to a website about this. Wireless medical telemetry is generally used to monitor a patient's vital signs. Examples of this would be pulse and respiration, using radio frequency or RF communication. These devices have the advantage of allowing patient movement without restricting patients to a bedside monitor with a hardwired connection. And there's a link shown there on the slide. So typical wireless medical devices, you see these on the left, and the next slide is a little bit better version of this. So there's an EDAN IT20 Wi-Fi based telemetry transmitter with standard ECG monitoring functionality and optional pulse oximetry, communicating with what's called an MFM CMS in real time. The IT20 enhances the overall monitoring, especially for in-hospital mobile cardiac patients and rehabilitations. It can also be applied as a backup device for emergency cases in hospitals. Other types of typical wireless medical devices. There's a wireless continuous non-invasive blood pressure and vital signs for Philips IntelliView patient monitors. You can see a screen there, and you see the device being worn on somebody's wrist, and then it looks like the device goes up around somebody's finger. As most are aware, new wearable devices have become quite popular in recent times. Great deal of product development of new and innovative wearable medical devices that transmit data wirelessly, and you've probably all seen commercials on TV for things like the Fitbit, or there's a heart monitoring device where you put your fingers on two pads and so on and so forth. So what about the FDA and the medical devices industry? Excuse me. The Federal Communications Commission establishes the Wireless Medical Telemetry Service, or WMTS, by allocating specific frequency bands that are used exclusively for wireless medical telemetry. You don't want interference for these devices when they're life and death devices. The WMTS set aside 14 megahertz of spectrum in 3 defined frequency bands. They are listed here: 608 to 614 megahertz, 1395 to 1400 megahertz, and 1427 to 1432 megahertz for primary or co-primary use by eligible wireless medical telemetry users. Additionally, many devices also use already in place Wi-Fi to relay their data via the internet. So here's some examples, e-healthcare examples. So these are different domains. If you take a look at this on the left, the body area domains. So you take a look at body sensors, ambient sensors, more body sensors in the bottom left there. Also looking at environmental conditions. The middle shows communication and networking domain. So it turns out that, you know, something like your smartphone or your laptop or a desktop computer, they're interconnected. Notice they show 3G in the middle, so that's dated. Then we have the service domain, where we have nurses, doctors, ambulances, and so forth, hospitals, and there are servers that take the data from the devices over in the middle, and of course the devices in the middle are getting the data from the sensors on the far left. So again, the future. So total number of active device connections worldwide. On this plot, it's predicted to be 34.2 billion by 2025. And notice the red are the IoT devices, the white are the non-IoT devices, or smartphones, we'll say. Notice that this prediction forecast from 2018 indicates the number of IoT devices will have exceeded non-IoT devices by 2021. Actually, that happened back in 2019. This is the start of a new paradigm where machine-to-machine traffic starts to exceed human application traffic over the internet. Other industries. There are many other industries that will use wireless IoT devices to implement cyber physical systems and or other types of control systems. Depending upon the industry, these devices will need to be certified. For the electrical industry, the NEMA, or National Electrical Manufacturers Association, is a body that certifies electrical devices. Certification will need to occur on an industry-by-industry basis.